A MundoCoop conversou com o antropólogo e futurista norte-americano Jamais Cascio, conhecido por ser o criador do termo mundo BANI e um dos principais pensadores globais. Nessa entrevista exclusiva, Jamais fala sobre o mundo complexo e caótico que estamos cercados e como podemos transformar o nosso modo de pensar e agir. Venha conferir! Por que a era em que vivemos é interpretada como caótica?
Ever since the end of the Cold War and the rise of the Internet, strategists and futurists have talked about a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, the so-called VUCA world. But what has come out of the 2010s, especially the latter half, goes beyond the levels of volatility, etc., that had been seen before. The problems hit harder, unleashed greater confusion, and seemed far more difficult to manage, let alone control. Big global systems have become less consistent. Even before the pandemic hit in 2020, we had global political movements organized using social media, technologies that allowed us to watch each other and destroy each other with far greater precision than ever before. The empowerment of marginalized communities for both good and bad. The rise of machine learning systems that were increasingly hard to understand, and overarching all of it, the compounding crisis of the global climate. Some of these, like climate damage, have been building for decades, but had started to accelerate. Others were surprising changes to our institutions and systems, and in a number of cases, the kinds of forces unleashed in the VUCA era had started to combine and reinforce each other, creating a world where we could no longer even begin to estimate consequences or see historical patterns. Especially in the global political space, we saw people and systems acting in ways that fell far outside what most people assumed to be definitive rules and norms. It became clear to me that there were forces that went beyond simple uncertainty or ambiguity and actively undermined our ability to plan for the future. And that's what became the BANI model. This doesn't mean that foresight is impossible in the BANI era, but that it has to push harder to illuminate possibilities that might previously have seemed outrageous. The kinds of responses to a BANI environment that I've talked about, such as resilience and improvisation, are all based on being ready to act when something entirely unexpected happens.
Como o conceito BANI nos prepara para o que está acontecendo no mundo de hoje?
BANI isn't meant to be a tool to make changes to organizations, at least not by itself. The language of BANI, brittleness, anxiety, non-linearity, and incomprehensibility, is a way to name and describe the kinds of chaos we see around us. In naming these forces, we start to see what kinds of responses and preparations might best make us able to succeed, or at least survive. You might think of BANI as a lens to bring issues into focus, or better still, as a prism that can take a raw beam of light and split it into its components. Seeing light as a spectrum tells us things about the world that wouldn't have been apparent before. So too with BANI. Ultimately, BANI represents my attempt to give voice to a growing sense of powerlessness that so many of us have felt in the face of the kinds of events and ongoing threats we've seen over the recent years. I honestly didn't make BANI with an eye towards it becoming a global concept. I really only made it as a way for myself to better study and understand what's been going on. That said, I'm very pleased that others have seen its utility too. And from what I've seen over the past couple of years of the spread of the BANI concept, many other people make use of BANI in the way that I imagined originally, using it not as a strategy guide or a rule book, but as a way to articulate and describe the mess that surrounds us everywhere. It's not meant as a replacement for VUCA so much as an extension. VUCA gave a name to the kinds of changes we were seeing in the 90s and 2000s. In many ways, it has become our everyday, constant environment. But if just about everything is VUCA, the term becomes much less useful as a way to distinguish and highlight the more radical, rapid, and surprising changes happening with greater frequency. And that's where BANI comes in.
Uma das siglas presentes no BANI é fragilidade. Quais as ferramentas para lidar com essa questão?
In English, The B in BANI stands for the word brittle, or brittleness. Although the meaning is similar, it's not identical to the more frequent translation as fragile or fragility. Something that is fragile is delicate and can easily be damaged. Moreover, it's usually evident that something is fragile and needs to be handled with care. Something that is brittle, however, is not visibly delicate and may appear strong and reliable, may even be strong and reliable, up to a point. But when it loses its strength, it doesn't just bend, it shatters. Something that is brittle can function exactly as intended, but then fail completely when it faces too much pressure. The method to counter brittleness is resilience. That's a term you may have seen with greater frequency over the past decade or two, and for good reason. Resilience means to be able to deal with a shock by absorbing it. Not just by resisting, but by bending if necessary, adapting to the new forces. Resistance is brittle. Resilience is flexible. Now, resilience is a term used in both psychology and material science, and it ultimately refers to a capacity to withstand unexpected shocks. And sometimes that can mean flexibility, being able to bend as needed and come back after the shock has passed. Sometimes that can mean graceful failure, where the resilient system can continue to perform at least some of its functions even as it's falling apart, or at least not cause additional harm when it fails. One of the less widely recognized characteristics of resilience is known as slack. Basically, it means having additional capabilities or resources beyond what you normally need in case of a sudden increase in demand, or simply emergency supplies. The challenge of resilience is that it can cost more than doing nothing. Making sure that components are flexible, that systems are designed to fail gracefully, and that you have extra capacity in case of emergency can be expensive.
Estar aberto a novos caminhos é a chave para o futuro das organizações?
The way I see it, nonlinear systems need improvisation, the ability to adapt quickly to unexpected changes and developments, to be creative under pressure. We typically think of improvisation as being a kind of acting, but the skill applies to much more than the stage. Improvisation means to take what you've been given, the situation, the demands, the constraints, and figuring out how to make something meaningful happen as a result. As taught in acting school, improvisation emphasizes the need not to fight against what you're given, rather to accept it, in total, as your reality in that moment. At an organizational level, improvisation means coming up with appropriate responses to situations based on the conditions of the moment, rather than simply based on a checklist of approved responses. That is, it requires that people not be restricted to just predetermined choices. Now, I should add here that it may end up being the case that the predetermined choices are appropriate. Frankly, under normal conditions, those predetermined choices may even be the best. But when conditions are no longer normal, just continuing to do what you've been doing, or worse, being forced to continue doing it, can sometimes have disastrous outcomes. But the question about legacy is interesting. Part of an organization's function is to determine which aspects of its legacy are truly core to its identity, and which ones are there because they've always been there. It's entirely possible to weave improvisation into an organization's practice, in essence, making it part of the legacy itself. The risk in improvisation is failure. If an improvised or novel approach is tried, something not on the predetermined list of options, but it fails to accomplish what is needed, many organizations will see that as a license to punish the improviser for trying something new.
A necessidade de saber o que nos espera está atrapalhando a sociedade no presente?
It's good for a society, even an organization, to think clearly about future possibilities, to prepare for the unexpected, and to be conscious of the consequences in the future of present-day decisions. The problem arises when only one official future becomes acceptable to discuss. Looking for future possibilities that fit the preferred story is no better than not looking ahead at all. Arguably, it's actually worse. Holding tight to a single official future means ignoring contrary developments and dismissing evidence that challenges that preferred outcome. Now, for many of us who do this kind of work, the language that we use helps to illuminate our perspectives. You will find very few good professional futurists who use the English word predict, meaning to describe an outcome before it happens. The word, in English, has an implication of certainty. If I predict something, I am claiming to be sure, to know that it will happen. Instead, most of us use the English term forecast, meaning to describe a possible outcome before it happens, and possibly along with the things that could make that outcome not happen. We usually see the word forecast associated with weather. When meteorologists make forecasts about the weather for tomorrow or next week, they will often emphasize that these are not certainties, but possibilities. A 50% chance of rain, for example. And most people know that the weather forecast will probably be mostly right, but won't be terribly surprised if it gets something wrong. So we look at the weather forecast anyway, because even something that's probably, but not definitely right, will still be helpful for us to plan our activities. Yeah, but here's where the comparison gets a little crazy. If we start seeing weather patterns that make no sense, where we have above average temperatures one day and Arctic conditions the next, we might start to think that the weather forecast is useless. But the weather forecast can still be useful when it starts to describe the underlying forces that shape the outcomes, and let us prepare not for a single probable weather outlook, but the wider range of plausible weather systems. In short, being resilient means to stick a small umbrella in our bag even when the forecast is sunny.
O que podemos aprender com esta transição do mundo VUCA para o mundo BANI?
Well, we can learn to be flexible. We are in a moment of history where the ability to recognize and respond creatively to rapid changes is the most important capability we have. Better still is to be conscious of our impact on others as you adapt. In the face of brittleness, be resilient, both personally and organizationally. Learn how you could bend rather than break. Figure out ways to add some slack, some extra capacity to your systems. Could be something as simple as emergency supplies at home. Could be something as complex as redundant systems to keep your organization going. And if you can't avoid failure in a situation, figure out how to fail gracefully. In an age of anxiety, be empathetic to others and to yourself. The chaotic moment we're in is happening to all of us, and we need to recognize and acknowledge that we're all feeling the effects of a dysfunctional system. In its simplest form, it's a willingness to be kind and forgiving, both to others and to ourselves. We all feel powerless. We don't need to make each other feel worse. When facing the nonlinear, be improvisational, adapting quickly to new conditions and experiences. In many cities around the world, you can take improv acting classes, where you're taught ways to recognize elements of change and to figure out how to respond while keeping the scene going. In other words, to acknowledge a changed reality, and to see ways to maintain yourself and your organization or community amidst that change. And when everything is incomprehensible, we can't just rely on our base of knowledge to figure out what to do. Sometimes we need to listen to our intuition. It's how our brains recognize subtle connections, or when something isn't quite right. Human brains are remarkable engines of pattern recognition, the product of millions of years of biological evolution. Reaching for insights when you don't know exactly what's wrong or what to do can sometimes be the only path to success, or potentially survival. And machines can't do it, not yet. Even the best GPT chatbot can't learn how to listen to a gut feeling. But you can. Resilience, empathy, improvisation, and intuition are all skills and capabilities that help us not just survive, but thrive in a chaotic world. And they're all very human traits.